Their vast technology and their great civilization was largely underground. They were, in those terms, the original cavemen, and they came out from their cities through caves also. Caves were not just places of protection in which unskilled natives squatted. They were often doorways to and from the cities of the Lemurians. Long after the cities were deserted, the following natives, uncivilized, found these caves and openings. In the period that you now think of as the Stone Age, the men you think of as your ancestors, the cavemen, often found shelter not in rough, naturally formed caves, but in mechanically created channels that reach behind them and in the deserted cities in which once the Lemurians dwelled. Some of the tools fashioned by the cavemen were distorted versions of those they had found. While the civilizations of the Lemurians was highly concentrated in that they made no attempt to conquer others or to spread out to any great extent in area, they did set out, over the centuries, outposts from which they could emerge and keep track of the other native peoples. These outposts were constructed underground. From the original cities and large settlements there were, of course, underground connections, a system of tunnels, highly intricate and beautifully engineered. Since these were an aesthetic people, the walls were lined with paintings and drawings, and sculpture was also displayed along these inner byways. There were various escalated systems, some conveying people on foot, some conveying goods. It was not practical to construct such tunnels to the many outposts, however, which were fairly small communities and relatively self-supporting. Some were a good distance away from the main areas of commerce and activity. These outposts were situated in many scattered areas, but there were a fairly large number of them in what is now Spain and the Pyrenees. There were several reasons for this, one having to do with the existence of rather giant-sized men in the mountain areas. Because of the timid nature of these Lemurian people, they did not enjoy outpost existence, and only the bravest and most confident of them were given such an assignment, which was temporary to begin with. The caves, again, served as doorways opening outward, and often what seemed to be the back of a cave was instead constructed of a material opaque from the outside but transparent from the inside. The natives of the area using such caves for natural shelter could therefore be observed without danger. These people reacted to sounds that are not audible to your ears. Their particular fear of violence intensified all of their mechanisms to an amazing degree. They were forever alert and on guard. This is difficult to explain, but they could mentally pitch a thought along certain frequencies, a highly distinguished art, and then translate the thought at a given destination in any of a number of ways, into form or color, for example, or even into a certain type of image. Their language was extremely discriminating in ways that you could not understand, simply because gradations in pitch, frequency, and spacing were so precise and complicated. Communication, in fact, was one of their strongest points, and it was developed to such a high degree simply because they feared violence so deeply and were constantly on the alert. They banded together in large family groups, again, in need for protection. Contact between children and parents was at a very high level, and children were actually uncomfortable if out of the sight of their parents for any amount of time. For these reasons, those individuals who ran the outpost felt themselves to be in a very uncomfortable situation. They were limited in numbers and largely cut off from the main areas of their own civilization. They developed, therefore, an even greater telepathic activity and a rapport with the earth above their head, so that the slightest tremor or footstep and the most minute movements above that was not usual were instantly noted. There were frequent peepholes, so to speak, through to the surface, from which they could make observations, and cameras situated there that kept the most precise pictures not only of the earth but of the stars. Of course, they had complete records of underground gas areas and intimate knowledge of the inner crust, keeping careful watch upon and anticipating earth tremors and faults. They were as triumphant about their descent into the earth as any race ever was who left the earth. This was, as I told you, the second and perhaps most interesting of the three civilizations. The first following generally your own line of development and faced many of the problems that you now do. They were largely situated in what you call Asia Minor, but they were also expansive and traveled outward to other areas. These are the people I mentioned earlier, who finally went on to other planets within other galaxies, and from whom the people of the Lemurians civilization came. Before we discuss the third civilization, there are a few more points I would like to make about the second one. This has to do with communication as it was applied to their drawings and paintings and to the highly discriminating channels that their creative communications could take. In many ways, their art was highly superior to your own and not as isolated. The various art forms, for example, were connected in a fashion that is nearly unknown to you, and because you are so unfamiliar with the concept, it will be rather difficult to explain. Consider, for example, something very simple, say a drawing of an animal. You would perceive it simply as a visual object, but these people were great synthesizers. A line was not simply a visual line, but according to an almost infinite variety of distinctions and divisions, it would also represent certain sounds that would be automatically translated. And as an observer could automatically translate the sounds before he bothered with the visual image, if he wanted to. In what would appear to be a drawing of an animal, then, the entire history or background of the animal might also be given. Curves, angles, lines, all represented beside their obvious objective function in a drawing. A highly complicated series of variations in pitch, tone, and value, or if you prefer, invisible words. Distances between the lines were translated as sound pauses, and sometimes also as distances in time. Color was used in terms of language in communication, in drawing and paintings, representing somewhat as your own color does emotional gradations. The color, however, its value of intensity served to further refine and define, for example, either by reinforcing the message already given by the objective value of the lines, angles, and curves, and by the invisible word messages already explained, or by modifying these in any given number of ways. The size of such drawings also spoke its own message. In one way, this was a highly stylized art, and yet it allowed for both great preciseness of expression in terms of detail and great freedom in terms of scope. It was obviously highly compressed. This technique was later discovered by the third civilization, and some of the remnants of drawings done in imitation of it still exist. But the key to interpretation had been completely lost, so all you could see would be a drawing devoid of the multi-sensual elements which gave it such great variety. It exists, but you could not bring it alive. I should perhaps mention here that some of the caves, particularly in certain areas of Spain and the Pyrenees, and some earlier ones in Africa, were artificial constructions. Now, these people moved mass with sound, and as I told you earlier, actually conveying matter through a high mastery of sound. This is how their tunnels were originally formed, and it was also the method used to form some of the caves in areas where originally there were few. Often drawings on the cave walls were highly stylized information, almost like signs.